Since the top flight of English football broke away from the Football League and became known as the Premier League in 1992, the landscape of English football has changed dramatically. Under the guidance of Alex Ferguson, Manchester United became the dominant force in English football for more than 2 decades. Meanwhile, Liverpool's dominance came to an abrupt end, with the club failing to win a league title during the Premier League era prior to this season. Arsenal, Everton, Liverpool, Manchester United and Spurs were the so-called Big Five who led the idea to form a breakaway league, but the Big 4, 5, 6 and even 7 has changed over the years, most notably with the rises in fortunes of both Chelsea and Man City. Lots of you have asked me to rank all the Premier League teams' histories prior to the creation of the Premier League in 1992, which I thought would be quite fun, but obviously it comes with some pitfalls. Just so we're clear, I'm not simply ranking the teams based on how many trophies they won prior to 1992. No, that would be far too easy and simplistic, and not very HITC Sevens like, since obviously different trophies are considered to be of different importance. So taken into consideration are obviously trophies, but also the importance of those trophies, cup final appearances, seasons spent in the top flight, calibre of former players, etc, etc. Hopefully, with a balanced and reasonable outcome that no one gets too upset about. Nah, who am I kidding? Here is my ranking of every team's historical success and performance prior to the creation of the Premier League in 1992. AFC Bournemouth. There are no two ways about it, Bournemouth are historically by far the least successful team in the Premier League right now. Formed in 1899 as Boscombe St John's Institute, later to become Bournemouth and Boscombe, and later just AFC Bournemouth prior to 2015, Bournemouth had never played top-flight football. The Cherries became a league side in 1923, but with the exception of a couple of seasons in the late 1980s, Bournemouth spent the entire pre-Premier League era in the 3rd and 4th tiers, and they never got further than the 5th round of the FA Cup. Brighton and HOVE Albion. The Premier League era has been 3 fine decades for clubs from the south of England, and a fairly turgid one for many in the north. Unlike Bournemouth, Brighton did play top-flight football before 1992, but only for 4 seasons between 1979 and 1983, with their highest league finish coming in 13th. Prior to that, the Seagulls spent an incredible 37 years in the 3rd Division South, from 1921 all the way to 1958, without tasting a single promotion or relegation. Brighton spent more seasons in the 3rd tier than any other before 1992, meaning I can only put them in 19th, but they did reach an FA Cup final in 1983, where they were well beaten in a replay by Manchester United. Crystal Palace. There's not much to split one of English football's more unusual rivalries between Brighton and Crystal Palace, with the Eagles coming in just 1 place ahead of the Seagulls. Palace also spent a remarkable amount of time, more than 3 decades, in the 3rd Division South, before dropping into the 4th tier when the Football League was fully de-regionalised. In total, Crystal Palace spent 9 pre-1992 seasons in the 1st Division, enjoying by far their best ever campaign, a 3rd place finish, just before the creation of the Premier League. Like Brighton, Palace were also 1-time FA Cup finalists in 1990, where they too took Manchester United to a replay before getting beat 1-0 thanks to a goal via the unlikely source of left-back Lee Martin. Watford. Moving up out of the historical top-flight relegation zone, but sticking with former stalwarts of the old 3rd Division South, Watford were founded in 1881, but they wouldn't taste second-tier football until 1969, and top-flight football didn't arrive until 1982. It was the great team of Barnes and Blissett, with Graham Taylor in the dugout and Elton John in the chairman's box, that took Watford into the top flight, and the club finished second to Liverpool in their first season in the 1st Division. That was, and still is, Watford's highest ever league finish, and the Hornets only spent 6 pre-1992 seasons in the top flight in total, reaching 1 FA Cup final in 1984, which they lost to Everton. Norwich City. Obviously, Norwich City have been relegated from the Premier League, meanwhile Leeds United have won promotion, but until I know exactly who will and won't be playing in the Premier League next season, these videos will feature the current 20 Premier League teams. Prior to the 1970s, Norwich were a team who flip-flopped between the 2nd and 3rd tiers, before Ron Saunders guided the club to promotion from the 2nd Division in 1972. The Canaries spent 17 of the following 20 seasons in the top flight before the birth of the Premier League, finishing 4th in their finest pre-Premier League campaign in 1989 and winning the League Cup twice in 1962 and 1985. Leicester City. Leicester City are the only team to have won the Premier League title that never won the First Division title, with their finest pre-Premier League season coming in 1929 when Arthur Chandler's goals fired the Foxes to a second-place finish, ending the season just 1 point behind champions the Wednesday. Leicester spent some 38 seasons in the top flight prior to 1992, and they had some brilliant players like Gary Lineker, Gordon Banks, Frank Worthington and Arthur Rowley over the years. The Foxes won the League Cup in 1964 but never got their hands on the FA Cup despite reaching 4 finals, which is the most of any team not to have won the competition. Southampton didn't reach the top flight until 1966, where the goals of Martin Chivers fired Ted Bates' side to promotion from the Second Division. Southampton spent all but 4 of the next 23 seasons in the First Division prior to the creation of the Premier League, enjoying their best campaign in 1983-84 when they finished as top-flight runners-up to Liverpool. Like Leicester, Southampton have reached 4 FA Cup finals, including 3 prior to 1992, but unlike Leicester, they did win one of them against Manchester United in 1976. Burnley. I must admit, I thought before I made this video that Burnley would feature a little higher, but then again, there are some really big clubs in the current Premier League. Burnley are the first team in this video to have been crowned champions of England, and they have done so twice, which is more than a few teams who finish above them in this video. Burnley's First Division titles came in 1921 and 1960, and the Clarets are one of the most impressive historical overachievers within the English game. Burnley's best team in the early 1960s had Jimmy McIlroy pulling the strings in midfield, and they reached an FA Cup final in 1962, which was the Clarets' third final appearance, but their only FA Cup win came in 1914. Burnley spent 47 seasons in the First Division in total before a collapse in the 1970s and 80s, which saw them drop into the Fourth Division for a number of years. Sheffield United. The only current Premier League team from one of football's spiritual homes, the city of Sheffield, Sheffield United, once spent 41 consecutive years as a First Division team, albeit during a period interrupted by the First World War. The Blades have won 4 pieces of major silverware, but not only did they all predate the Premier League era, they all predate John Logie Baird inventing the world's first working mechanical television. Sheffield United won a First Division title in 1898, as well as winning the FA Cup in 1899, 1902, 1915 and 1925. They may have won nothing of note since 1925, but the club still spent many seasons in the top flight prior to the mid to late 1970s, so they take 12th place. West Ham. West Ham's inclusion in 11th could be deemed as controversial, since the Hammers haven't won a First Division title, but they do fare pretty well in terms of all other criteria. Between 1958 and 1992, West Ham spent just a handful of seasons outside of the top flight, coming closest to winning the title in 1986 when the Hammers' so-called Boys of 86 finished in 3rd place behind only Liverpool and Everton. Whilst league success has evaded the London club, they have reached 5 FA Cup finals, winning 3 of them, with all 3 successes coming prior to 1992. West Ham also reached 2 League Cup finals, won a European Cup Winners' Cup, and provided England with some of their key men as the Three Lions won the 1966 World Cup. Chelsea. In terms of major trophies, Chelsea's pre-1992 record isn't all that impressive, but that isn't a true reflection of their standing within the game prior to the Premier League's creation. Chelsea spent 58 seasons in the First Division prior to 1992, and they were no strangers to finishing in the top 6, particularly during the 1960s. Chelsea's only pre-1992 League and FA Cup titles came in 1954-55 in terms of the First Division and 1969-70 in terms of the FA Cup, and the Blues also won a League Cup and a UEFA Cup Winners' Cup before the Premier League came into existence. Manchester City. In 9th and 10th place, we have 2 clubs who are often accused of having very little history, but that isn't really the case. Whilst Chelsea and Man City have enjoyed by far their greatest eras of success since the arrival of vast investment from billionaire oligarchs and Middle Eastern royals, both have always been big clubs. Only 5 teams have spent more seasons in England's top flight than Manchester City, who spent 69 seasons in the First Division before 1992, winning league titles in 1937 and 1968, as well as the FA Cup in 1904, 1934, 1956 and 1969, the League Cup in 1970 and 1976, and the UEFA Cup Winners' Cup in 1970. From Billy Meredith to Bert Troutman and Colin Bell, the Citizens have had some majestic players over the years, and 9 pre-1992 trophies rather reflects that fact. Wolves. Wolves are a very significant club historically in terms of not just the English, but also the European game, and that's perhaps a topic that I could cover in a video at some stage. Wolves are one of the oldest teams in the Premier League, founded in 1877, and they were one of 12 founding members of the Football League in 1888, finishing third that season. The Wanderers wouldn't win their first top-flight title until the 1950s, but they won 3 titles during the 1950s as arguably the decade's finest English club. In addition to 3 First Division titles, Wolves also won 4 FA Cups, 2 League Cups, and reached the UEFA Cup final prior to 1992, spending 60 seasons in the First Division, so they're a good bet for 8th place. Newcastle United. A little like Sheffield United, although to a slightly lesser extent, Newcastle United are a club who have won a number of trophies, but none of real note for a very long time. My apologies to anyone who considers the Intertoto Cup to be a major trophy. The Magpies are 4-time champions of England and 6-time FA Cup winners, but the most recent of those successes came in 1955. Meanwhile, the club did win the Intercities Fairs Cup in 1969 and the Intertoto Cup in 2006. Despite a lack of post-50s success, Newcastle were still top-flight regulars, enjoying 63 seasons in the First Division in total. Tottenham Hotspur. Tottenham's trophy cabinet is a bit of a mixed bag, since it can boast only 2 league titles, which puts them level with Burnley and Portsmouth, but they've enjoyed much more success in the cup competitions. In fact, prior to 1992, Tottenham were the most successful team in the history of the FA Cup, having won 8 trophies in total from 9 final appearances. Spurs also won the League Cup twice, the UEFA Cup twice, and became the first British side to win a European trophy in the 1963 UEFA Cup Winners' Cup. In many respects, England's ultimate cup team prior to the creation of the Premier League, so Spurs deservedly take 6th. Everton. Everton are giants of the English game, having been founding members of the Football League in 1888 and having spent just 4 seasons outside of the top flight since. That means Everton have spent far more seasons at England's top flight, whether you include the Premier League era or not, than any other club. The Toffees haven't just been there to make up the numbers during their 117 top-flight campaigns, having had really great teams, particularly during the 1930s and 80s. Everton won 9 top-flight titles in total prior to 1992, in addition to 4 FA Cups, 2 League Cups, and a European Cup Winners' Cup. It's quite possible that Everton's brilliant side of Southall, Lineker and the like may have won more European honours were it not for England's 5-year ban from UEFA. But even in spite of that fact, the Toffees come in 5th. Aston Villa. Aston Villa fall short of Everton in terms of league titles and seasons spent in the top flight, but they just edge the Toffees on every other front. Unlike Everton's great team of the 1980s, Villa's fine team early that decade weren't banned from Europe, and they won a European Cup final against Bayern Munich in 1982. That's arguably the most significant of Villa's many trophies, which include 7 league titles, 7 FA Cups, and 5 League Cups, and of them all but 2 League Cups were won before the Premier League era. Villa have spent the second most seasons in England's top flight, trailing only Everton, although they face a tough battle to retain their top flight status this season. Arsenal. Arsenal are the most successful football club from the south of England by almost any measure, with the sole exception of European Cups. The Gunners were the first team from the south of England to join the Football League and the first to reach the First Division. Their first top-flight title didn't arrive until the 1930s, but they absolutely dominated that decade, winning 5 league titles in total. Arsenal won a total of 10 First Division titles before the creation of the Premier League, in addition to 5 FA Cups, 1 League Cup, and 1 Intercities Fairs Cup. Arsenal have also spent the 4th most seasons in the top flight of the English game, way ahead of any other southern club, and they hold the record for the most consecutive top flight seasons. Manchester United. It was a tight call between Arsenal and Manchester United, whose pre-1992 trophy cabinets are rather similar in number, but a little different in makeup. Manchester United won 3 fewer First Division titles prior to 1992 than Arsenal, but they won more FA Cups, and unlike the Gunners, they did win the European Cup. In total, pre-1992 Manchester United won 7 First Division titles, 7 FA Cups, 1 League Cup, 1 European Cup, and 1 European Cup Winners' Cup. The Red Devils have also had arguably the most illustrious list of former greats in the history of the English game, with a trio of Ballon d'Or winners in their forward line at one stage, and their trophy cabinet would likely be a lot larger were it not for the horrific Munich air disaster. Liverpool. A very easy decision in top spot, primarily down to their domination during the 1970s and 80s, Liverpool were by far the most successful team in the English game before the arrival of the Premier League. The Reds first reached the First Division in 1894, and they have spent all but 10 seasons in the top flight ever since. Liverpool had a difficult 8 years from the mid-1950s into the early 1960s, finding themselves stuck in the Second Division, but the arrival of Bill Shankly in December 1959 changed everything. He laid the groundwork for a world-class side, and Liverpool ran rampant, particularly between 1975 and 1990. In total, the Reds won 18 First Division titles, 5 FA Cups, 4 League Cups, 4 European Cups, and 2 UEFA Cups before 1992. The most successful and dominant team in the English game prior to 1992, and it isn't even close. So that's it for today's video. Thank you all for watching, smash the like button if you enjoyed it, I look forward to all your comments, abusive or otherwise, and don't forget to make sure you are subscribed to HITC Sevens. And if you're a big fan of the channel, feel free to give me a follow on Twitter and Instagram, where the username is simply @HITC Sevens on both platforms.